Yeah, another thing about MK Ultra is they like all the studies they did on the prisoners, like Whitey Bulger.
Yeah,
apparently, like what's the story with him and MK Ultra?
Well, the government admitted after he died. That's when it came out. I can't remember who. I think it was a journalist or something, or maybe it was during his trial.
I thought he was like openly talking about it.
Yeah, he was talking about it, but nobody would believe it.
Mm-hmm.
But during his trial, I think it was his lawyers were able to get his prison records. And somebody sent them to me recently where they have the dates that he's given LSD. And this was all in the 50s, you know, before Manson was in prison, but in the 50s, he was still a kid. He got out of prison in 67 to 32, so 57, he would have been 22. He was in the same prisons that were treating people like Bulger experimentally with LSD. So one of the jurors who convicted Whitey Bulger reached out to me when my book came out, and she's gotten a lot of national attention. She didn't know that there was a little bit of mention in the trial, but the judge wouldn't let too much of it in. After he was convicted, he started writing her and telling her all about the experiments. And she is a very good reporter. She's not a journalist, but she lives in Boston. And she started looking into it, working with researchers, and found out that it was much more extensive than anybody ever knew and could have been the reason he became such a violent sociopath. It
was when he was very young. When
Yeah.
that happened, and then when he became a notorious killer after.
And then the entire time being protected by the government. He was a federal informant, you know, and well, with two agents who the FBI denies that anybody but the agents knew that he was in that they were rogue agents that were paying him to get information and provoking him and stuff. So she wanted me to write a book with her. And I just said, I can't do something just on Whitey, but keep coming to me with your information. And so we've been sharing information since then. I haven't talked to her for a few months, so I don't know if she found another author. But yeah, Whitey Bulger had what happened to, I believe, Manson in prison on paper. I don't have a record yet like she got, but I'm working with some people now trying to get records from when he was in prison. And they won't release them because they say they're medical records. But he's a convicted, dead, notorious criminal. So I actually have a lot of work to do. I have to find out how they got the medical records of Whitey. I think it was because Whitey was alive and Whitey shared them and he had access to his own records. Mm-hmm. But I don't think I'm ever going to get the rest of the records from, if you read in the book, it took me like 2 years to get the records I did get from the Bureau of Prisons about Manson. And at trial, when he was convicted, his defense attorney was trying to get his prison record, and they wouldn't release it to him. And this was during the death penalty phase of the trial. And when I talked to experts about that, they said anything should be allowed to be introduced when somebody's life is at stake. So the state was arguing for Manson and the others to be, executed. Mm-hmm. Irving Kinerick, the defense attorney, wanted to show that Manson had always been a docile prisoner, had never been badly behaved in prison, never been violent, and he couldn't believe that the government, the U.S. government, wouldn't release the record. And he screamed and hollered, and since the trial was such a circus, and Irving Kinerick was pretty crazy too, nobody took him seriously, and it wasn't, I talk about it in my book, the Attorney General in 1971, John Mitchell, who ended up going to his prison himself for being part of Nixon's cabinet and part of the plumbers and stuff, in the mid to late 70s, he sent a representative of the Department of Justice who worked beneath him to argue to the judge against releasing Manson's file. I can't find evidence of that happening in any other case in the history, but I believe that's just like the Watson tapes. There's secrets in there about what was going on with Manson's head and what they were doing to it that they're never going to share. Wow. So the record I got was, I think, 70 pages out of probably 300 or 400. They described it. Kinerick got somebody to describe what the parole record looked like, and I think they said it was like 2 phone books thick. And I got like that much.
So who was his parole officer before he went in for the 7 years?
That was interesting. The parole officer who violated him so he got convicted for the stealing the letter in the
the mailbox.
the mailbox, yeah. And that was a 10-year sentence. And he was released, I think, after 2 years on parole. And then within a month or two, he didn't show up for a parole hearing, or not a parole hearing, an appointment with his parole officer. They immediately violated him, sent federal marshals to Texas, who went into Mexico where they had information that he was in Mexico. The Mexicans turned him over to the marshals at the border of Laredo, Texas. They don't do that for these small-time criminals. Right. And then they brought him back to L.A., and then he was sent to do the next 8 years of his prison sentence, which would have taken him, I think, to 69 or 70. But then they decided to release him 2 years early in 67 so he could go and do what he did.
What the hell?
What's so ironic, and I mentioned this in the book, he got sent back to prison for missing one appointment, one meeting. You're supposed to go either once a week or once a month. Roger Smith, when he was his parole officer, he wouldn't show up for meetings, and then when he was down in L.A., for months at a time, and he was never violated. He was getting arrested for rape, for drug possession, for pimping during 67 to 69. Charges dropped every time. In my book, I have a scene where I take this record that I had gotten, a few pages they released to me, the prisons, to this retired district attorney named Louis Watnick in Van Nuys. And
is he the judge?
He was a judge, yeah.
Right. Okay.
So he had been a DA, and then he became a judge in I think it was Van Nuys, and then he retired, and he was sick and dying, and he's like on a oxygen machine, so he's raspy. But I had a tape recorder. And he's going through my documents, and Manson had come before him when he was a judge on some petty charge, and he said, I dismissed him on that case, I remember, because there was no evidence, but it was something like breaking into a car or something. But he remembered very well. But then he was looking, he said, I had no idea. And he said, there's something, this is chicken shit, this is all chicken shit.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what's chicken shit? He goes, well, obviously people make mistakes. We're a bureaucratic system, but this is like almost every other week he's getting picked up, taken in, booked, and then released without charges. All of these are violations of his parole. He should have been sent back 10 different times on this stuff you're showing me, but he also should have been prosecuted on half of these things, and they just dropped the charge. He goes, somebody wanted him out. He was more valuable to people outside than inside. Somebody worked to keep him out on the street.
Like he was an informant?
That's what I said. You mean like an informant? He goes, well, people confuse what an informant is. An informant doesn't just provide information. Sometimes, and there's a history of it, they can provoke other criminals to commit crimes. They can conspire with them and then walk away. And then the police know what's going to happen right before it happens. They can be much more proactive. So he said, he goes, you got to find out who he was working for. I go, how am I going to find out? He goes, I don't know, you're the journalist. And I go, well, who do you think it was? He goes, well, I'd start with the Los Angeles Sheriff's Office, then go to the LAPD. He goes, they're not going to tell you, but that's who you should look at. And I go, is that it? He goes, no, DEA, FBI. He didn't say the CIA. But he said it could have been any number of agencies who he was either sharing information, was sharing something with, and they wanted it to keep going. But there's no way this is an anomaly, like just a couple mistakes. He goes, this is a pattern. There's no way we would have missed this.
Whoa.
And what was important about him was he was in law enforcement, from the prosecution side and then as a judge during that same period. So, a lot of times if I show it to somebody now, they'd say, well, of course he should have been picked up. We have computers, but you didn't. So he was important because he knew exactly how they shared information, how it came in. At that time. And even Roger Smith's relationship with Manson, his parole officer for the first year, while he became Charlie Manson. He came out of prison. He was panhandling, playing guitar in the Bay Area, gets hooked up with Roger, and within a couple months has this following of women. The first 6 months, I think he had anywhere from 4 or 5 to 10 women that were following him all over the Bay Area, going to the clinic. He would leave the women with the doctors to get tested, you know, for VD and get, some of them were pregnant, get pregnancy attention. And he'd go in and meet with Roger for his parole hearings. And everybody, you know, they described it to me. I'm not the first one to report it. They said the women would follow Manson. They never stood beside him. They always had to be behind him. They wouldn't spoke unless he spoke to them first. They would pick things up for him. They were like slaves. How did he become this guru in a few months? How did he develop the skill to all of a sudden have these people do whatever he said, and then within 2 years, do whatever he said, including go kill some strangers in a house that you've never been to before except for text,
Right.
and do it, you know, with as much, you know, brutality as imaginable, and then come back and not even be remorseful about it. So that's the kind of thing that, you know, the book shows what was basically withheld from the public, and that's what Bugliosi did. You know, he wrote the best-selling true crime book of all time. And
Helter Skelter.
Helter Skelter, yeah. That to this day, you can probably go into any bookstore.
Yeah, even if you Google like Charles Manson documentary or book, there's also a documentary called Helter Skelter.
Well, no, there's 2 scripted movies.
Oh, okay, so it's a movie.
The first one that was made in the book came out in 74, I think, and then the first TV movie, it was a 2-night movie, which they didn't do back then. It was like a big event, I think was 76, and at that point, it was the highest rated TV movie in the history of television. It took 1 and 2 spot, I think. Number 1 was the second part, and number 2 was the first. Then he remade it in the early 2000s. He updated. I mean, it was the exact same story, but it was new actors. You know,
Bugliosi's narrative.
Bugliosi's narrative again, yeah. And then, you know, in my book, they'll see it opens with our confrontation, my confrontation with Vince in his kitchen, where he's threatening me and trying to stop the book and writing to my publisher and calling me at all hours of the night.